Hi and welcome back to the channel. Because this is the Friday/Saturday video, depending on where you live, it's science fiction time again, and I was looking through my major science fiction movie tome, which is the Overlook Film Encyclopedia, which is full of information about science fiction films. And I came upon something that I've wanted to do for a while. I want to do a series of videos about milestone science fiction films, the ones that really move the genre forward. So here's the question. What was the first full-length feature film space opera? Now, we have to define our term. Space opera is a movie about interplanetary adventures. So things like the movie serials of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Well, Flash Gordon, yeah, but Flash Gordon. Forbidden Planets, space opera. Star Trek's a space opera. And so that's the kind of genre I'm talking about. But what was the very first one that came before the others and in some ways set out a template for those feature films? Some people would say it's 1924's Aelita, the Russian film about a trip to Mars, which is a good film. I've seen it and I recommend it. But that's not it. The other question is, which nation produced the first science fiction space opera? And that's where it gets interesting, because it was Denmark. Denmark made the first space opera in 1918. Production of the film was done before the end of World War I, the war to end all wars. It was a movie called, he said, mispronouncing it atrociously, Himmelskibet. It's more widely known as A Trip to Mars. It's also known as the Airship, the Skyship, or 400 million miles from Earth. I only found out about this movie yesterday, and I found it and I watched it, and it's kind of interesting. You got to remember, this movie was made 23 years after the Lumiere brothers and all of the other people in France started what we now know as cinema. And so it's very rough around the edges. It's very unlike a modern science fiction film. There are some interesting things, like as much as possible was filmed in daylight because studio lighting was quite difficult to do. And also the acting is very, very much broadly theatrical. There's lots of gestures and there's lots of exaggerated facial expressions, and some of the makeup is kind of heavy. But it works. It was entertaining. It runs about 80 minutes, which is a fair length for a film. And it's about the first trip to Mars. Now, the spaceship they use is called the Excelsior, and don't expect too much of the spaceship. You've got to remember, this is before people like Robert Goddard were experimenting with rockets. It looks like a really chubby biplane. It's got a propeller on the back, and they talk vaguely about a mysterious engine they've got that'll let them get to Mars. So we'll let that pass. These guys basically didn't know any better. And so it's the story of a professor called Professor Planetarios and his son Avanti Planetarios, who is a sea captain who later went on to be an aeronaut. We see all this during the movie. And then, as his father discovered the means by which to fly to Mars, he had a passion project for 2 years to build the Excelsior and travel to Mars. He had a big meeting about it. People were sent from around the world. There's an Indian guy who is sent to be part of the crew. There's a rather portly American guy who comes on board, and a bunch of other technicians. They end up with a crew of about 8 people, including Avanti and his best friend, Dr. Kraft, who is in love with Avanti's sister, Corona. So they build the ship, and the ship takes off pretty much like an aeroplane. It's on wheels. You see some aerial shots around Denmark and Copenhagen. There's some nice aerial photography there, which is slightly janky, but you've got to remember they probably filmed it out of the side of a biplane. 6 months later, things are getting a little fractious on board the ship. The American guy, whose name is David Dane, which is odd because Dane on a Danish film. But anyway, he starts getting on the piss a bit and starts drinking, and they start getting themselves a mutiny on board amongst the crew, except for the loyal Dr. Kraft. Meanwhile, everyone at home thinks that they're dead. There's no radio communication between Earth and 2/3 the way to Mars. There's all of that kind of problem. And Professor Planeterios' enemy, the aptly named Professor Dubious, is spreading a lot of disinformation. Dubious has always been cynical about the trip. Right at the start, he argued against it in the big meetings that they had. Just before the ship left, he gave them a big envelope and said, "I've got a letter here for Venus. Can you give it to them when you get there?" He's basically taking the mickey out of them. And so he's a nasty pasty and undermines Professor Planeterios all the time that his son is heading towards Mars. And then we see the Martians. The Martians are all wearing white robes and really groovy clothing and have these big temples. And they see this ship approaching their planet and they decide to give it a hand. So they aim a ray gun at it and pull it in 10 times faster than the ship could normally travel. And the mutiny is all forgotten. All the guys kind of go, okay, yeah, that was a bit silly. Let's not do that. Character motivation is not a large thing here. And so they land on Mars and meet the Martians, who are all wearing robes and all have long flowing hair and funny headdresses. And they invite them for a meal, of course, and they're all a bit friendly. They invite them for a meal and they find out that the people on Mars eat fruit. That's all they eat. They're fructivorous. And so to be friendly, Avanti goes and gets some food and alcohol from the ship, which is basically tinned beef and wine. And the Martians are a bit shocked because these people eat dead meat. You know, how do you get the dead meat? Well, you've got to kill the animal. And killing things is a taboo on Mars, even though Avanti shows them how he gets meat by shooting a bird. And this giant kind of like turkey-sized bird gets shot. And the Martians are a little upset about that. Things get a bit fractious, and one of the crew throws a hand grenade which kills the Martian. This then gives the movie an opportunity to show how the Martians do their laws, which is they take you to a temple of regret and you think about what you did, and there's something in the temple that makes you question yourself and feel the guilt that you should feel for committing a crime. Meanwhile, amongst all this, Avanti falls in love with Maria, who is the daughter of the Martian leader, because that's something that didn't just happen in 1950s American science fiction movies. It predates that a lot. And she doesn't know whether she's in love with him. So she gets him to sit underneath the tree of dreaming, and if he dreams about her, then they are meant for each other and they can get married. Of course, he dreams about her. And then they go to the forest of love, and that's how they get married. So they give you a different Martian culture, which is contrasted and conflicted with the culture that they have on Earth. And there's also a scene where they go to the equivalent of a museum and see how brutal life on Mars used to be. But now they live peacefully amongst each other and they thrive. They're technologically advanced and they've got all their ducks lined up. Keep in mind, this movie was made in 1918 at the end of a war that turned Europe into a meat mincer. And so it's a pacifist film. It argues against war, against violence, and against eating meat. It's really an interesting response that the makers of the film had to the situations in which they were living. And that gives it an interesting historical context. And we of course know that, the end of World War I started the events that led to World War II. The reparations that were demanded from Germany, the hyperinflation and the poverty in Germany gave rise to the Nazi Party and Hitler and all that kind of stuff. But this is a kind of innocent pacifism in this film. The film ends in some really interesting ways. I'm going to do slight spoilers, but I don't think that if you see the film, and I'm going to show you how to see the film at the end of the video, you're not going to lose anything by knowing the ending because you can pretty much predict it. The crew go back to Earth along with Maria, who's in love with Avanti, the captain. And as they're heading back, Professor Planeterios, the father, is despondent. He thinks his son's died. It's been many months since the Excelsior left Earth. And he's about to kick the bucket, but he doesn't quite. And then the Excelsior appears in the skies above Madagascar, and that gets reported by cable. Then it appears and lands in Copenhagen again. And just as it lands in the middle of a large thunderstorm, Professor Dubious, who is cheesed off by the fact that they've actually come back and everything he said was a load of rubbish, is standing on a cliff, gets hit by a bolt of lightning and falls off the cliff, which is incredibly convenient. And that's the film. That's basically the film. But it's interesting. It's got a lot of the plot beats that you get in a standard space opera. You got the building of a spaceship, you got traveling to another planet, you got meeting an alien civilization, you got coming back from the planet. First Men in the Moon's got that plot. Forbidden Planet, in a sense, has got that plot. It is the template plot for space opera. And it was made 103 years ago. 104 if you're watching this later on. It's a fascinating film for that reason. If you're at all interested in looking at the original gangster versions of various things that you know and love in modern cinema, then seeing A Trip to Mars is something that you've got to do. It is a really interesting little film. The title cards are in Danish and in English, so that's pretty good. It was restored in 2006 by the Danish Film Institute. And here's where it gets interesting for you, because they made it available on YouTube. There is a really nice high-definition print of it on YouTube for you to watch. It isn't one of those blurry prints that you get with a lot of things. This one is as crisp as you're going to get. I'm going to paste a link to it in the notes on this video. And I really recommend that you watch it because it's such a fascinating film. It's that first film telling a story that's still being told a century and a bit later. And that's kind of cool. I really enjoyed watching it, and I really loved the fact that I serendipitously discovered it while I was noodling through a reference book. So anyway, that's about it for this time around. Thank you very much for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell. And if you are of a particularly generous nature, you can become a patron of the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. Okay, so that's it. Look after yourselves. Be safe. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Watch some really old science fiction movies because they do have a certain charm about them. And I'll catch you next time.